Yay! So please have a seat. Get situated. Wow, that was very gosh, everybody's so good today. That was very good. Welcome. My name is Kathy Schlen-Files, and I am the director. I'm sorry, I broke my thumb falling off my couch, so you can kind of see where I'm at. I'm the director of the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute at UConn, and it is such a pleasure to have all of you here. The focus of this event is Roger Buckley. Roger, would you please stand? And I don't want to take up too much time, but one of the things that I want to stress from the outset is that I first met Roger when I was interviewing here in 2006. And one of the things that really struck me about Roger administratively and in terms of his scholarship was his absolute capaciousness. And I think that that will come through in spades today. Roger is not only a renowned military historian, he's also known for his work on internment, his groundbreaking work on Fred Ho, really getting the Fred Ho archive here. He also does what most people in English, which is my field, want to do, which is write interesting, beautiful novels, something that I will never be able to do because my writing's like stereo hookup instructions. But so we'll actually kind of reflect on Roger's legacy and also his scholarly movement throughout his career. The last thing that I'll say about Roger is that Roger was the founding director of the Asian American Studies Institute, which is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. And yes. And for those of us who know how difficult it is to program, build ethnic studies, particularly within a neoliberal context, imaginary, the fact that Roger built up such a wonderfully vibrant institute made my job a lot easier. And in an email that I had written celebrating Roger's recent retirement, I said that, Roger worked behind the scenes fighting battles that I didn't have to fight. And he did so as a labor of love and as unparalleled commitment. And I am forever grateful not only for your example, but also for your legacy. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to our first speaker. I'm going to do a brief introduction. And the way that we envision this event is each speaker will give a presentation and there will be Q&A. Some of you know that I am very good at keeping time, so I will actually cut people off when we're at the end. I used to be a bouncer, so I will have my stick and I will say time's up, but I think that we'll have a very vibrant conversation. I really want to move the program. So our first speaker is Barry Gaspar, who is professor of history at Duke University. Dr. Gaspar concentrates on comparative slave systems with a special interest in the development of slave society and the evolution of slave life in the United States and the Caribbean, the Atlantic slave trade, Atlantic history and culture, the legacy of slavery in post-slave societies, historical geography, colonial British America, and Caribbean and Afro-American history are also major fields of interest. And there's a lot of intersection between Dr. Gaspar's work and Roger's early work as a military historian. He has published articles on slave resistance and social control, and his study Bondmen and Rebels, a study of master slave relations in Antigua, was published by Johns Hopkins University Press, and he co-edited More Than Chattel, Black Women and Slavery in the Americas, published by Indiana University Press. He is currently working on transitions and patterns of slave revolt in the Caribbean and North America. So please help me welcome Dr. Gaspar.
All right, thank you very much for this opportunity to be present at this occasion, which I thought when I was invited that this is something that I have to do. I mean, there's no two ways about it. Since I had not seen Roger, Professor Buckley, for many years, and because I thought this must be an important occasion, not because I was invited, but because it had something to do with Roger and his work. So I want to get right into my remarks here today. The most important thing, of course, is that I acknowledge that I have learned so much from Dr. Buckley's work. And he may not know it, but even the first time when we met in the 1970s in London when he was doing his initial research and so forth, I was quite impressed with his project. And it looked like a project that I had thought about doing myself. And then I said, okay, I think it's in good hands, so I can get ahead with what I was doing, which had to do with something a little different. But I thought that ultimately I would get around to working on different types of military history related to the Caribbean. So I'm very happy to be here and I appreciate very much the opportunity to comment on Roger's work and his contribution to the profession and so forth and so on. When some years ago, when I just graduated from University of the West Indies, my idea was to work with Professor Elsa Gavaya, one of the major historians of the Caribbean, who died many years ago. But I had read one of her books as an undergraduate. When I say I had read one of her books, I mean I literally crawled through the book. There was not a single illustration, no photographs, nothing, just heavy argument. And I made my case through that book. And I think when I look back that this is the kind of book that actually got me thinking seriously about reading history and maybe becoming a historian. But really and truly, I did not want to become a historian from the very beginning. I wanted to become a writer. And you can see, therefore, from these remarks that there is a kind of connection with the route that Roger's own career has taken. Anyway, I went to Gavaya's office one day and I said that I wanted to work with her, and my project would be the response of slaves in the Caribbean during periods of warfare to slavery and their lives. And she said, my God, this is a wonderful story, wonderful subject, but I know nothing about it. I said, okay, that's all right. I mean, I'll come in again and we can talk about what my work is going to be. Then things happened and I switched and went to Johns Hopkins University where I got into another bigger project, which was a slave conspiracy that developed in Antigua in 1736. And what I wanted to do really was to see through this conspiracy how that slave society worked. Now, people who read the book think that I'm actually writing in depth solely about the conspiracy, but that's not the case. It's really, I'm looking through the conspiracy, the lens of the conspiracy, at the society and see how it works. My idea was that if I understood how a slave society worked in all its complexity, I can then tackle any slave society in the world and at any time. That was the idea of me training myself, because you can't always be sure that the professors that you work with will understand what it is you're trying to do. In fact, when I went to Johns Hopkins, the following day after I arrived, I told the professor what I was working on. He said, it can't be done. I said, oh, good, that's great. That's the incentive that I need. So this has sort of shaped my career. But the work that Gavaya had done on the Leeward Islands, because the book that she wrote was Slave Society in the Leeward Islands at the end of the 18th century, that work opened up all kinds of possibilities for more elaborate kinds of investigations of slave society in the Caribbean. Now, this is not just slavery now, this is slave society. And therefore, when I ran into Roger and he said what his project was going to be about slave society, and particularly connected with the end of the 18th century into the Napoleonic Wars, related, for example, to the emergence of the West India regiments and so forth. I'm saying, oh my God, this is terrific. But in my own head, if I were going to do this, it would have taken me 10 more years to get into it because I was doing something else. So I went into his camp, so to speak, mentally, and so forth, and really supported his work. So I was very happy to see when that book was published, the response that it got in 1979. That book, Slaves in Redcoats, the British West India Regiment, 1795 to 1815. Just as I was interested in war and society, that book discusses several features of the interlocking connections between war and society, in particular slave society. That work is a seminal work. Now, it has to be said that not much has been done, or had been done even when Roger began his work, on military history in the Caribbean in a really serious academic sense. We had reports from the field, from Army officers and so forth. We had various other kinds of memoir written by Army folks and so on. But beyond the work done by Richard Pears in the 1950s and so forth, in the book, for example, War and Trade, we haven't really had anything. So when Roger came along saying he wanted to do this, fine. I mean, this is just terrific. Now, I always get excited by other people's work, you see what I'm saying? I mean, because I have the feeling that I can learn from these folks. And I don't have to wait, for example, for them to publish stuff. Like in conversation, I can just learn a hell of a lot because I'm just picking up stuff like some kind of sponge, which really I am, academic sponge. So that book, when it was published, struck me as very interesting. It set the foundations for the kind of work that could be done in the future, setting the pace, so to speak. But it was interesting also from the point of view that although it was a very important book, Roger was not making lunatic claims or over-expansive claims about the importance of his work. And so it has been left to scholars coming along to really point to that work and show how important it was to the kind of insights that we now get as scholars when we write about slave society in the Caribbean or in the Atlantic Basin, for example, during the 18th century particularly, when there was so much warfare. So, reading Roger's first book got me so excited that I began to anticipate that there must be something else coming out of his mind, that fertile mind, that would get us even more excited. And of course, I mean, I hate to say that I was right, but I mean, I was. The second book that I want to refer to is the book, The British Army in the West Indies, Society and the Military in the Revolutionary Age, which is, to me, one of those fantastic books that, again, sets the pace and sets the agenda for the kind of work that coming generations of scholars will have to get involved in. So I don't know, I mean, if there's any better way for a scholar to establish a reputation for relevance and the kind of contribution that his or her work makes to the future. And all of this, I say, in order to point to Roger's work in the military history of the Caribbean, the Atlantic, connected with slavery, the slave trade, African diaspora, and so forth, as fundamentally seminal. Fundamentally seminal. I am now working, for example, on a project that has to do with the 7 Years' War, which I only touched on in my first book. But I deliberately only touched on it in my first book because I wanted to whet people's appetite for what was to come. It is about to come. That is to say, I'm opening up this section on my first book to talk about the British recruitment of slaves from their own Caribbean islands for the invasion of French and Spanish territory in the Caribbean during the 1750s, early 1760s. So we're talking about Martinique, Guadeloupe, and also Cuba. These slaves that I'm talking about were recruited by the British during the 7 Years' War for the invasion of foreign territory are not meant to be used as combat troops, but as military labor, to provide the manual labor needed to assist the British troops who are not acclimated to the Caribbean epidemiological environment, for example, and so it's a good idea if they could get this done. Now, there's all kinds of beautiful materials in there. But it occurred to me that one of the reasons why I can see so much in that type of material is because of the work that I had done previously on slave society, trying to understand what slaves are doing, what their lives are about, and so on, in relation to slave society in Antigua or the Leeward Islands, and the conspiracy that of 1736. Well, the British were now going to use these slaves to invade foreign territory, which is to say, taking the slaves out of their home islands to go invade someplace else, and so forth and so on. Some of these slaves would find themselves operating as scouts and rangers and so forth and so on, and being involved in certain types of innovative emerging military practices, such as the use of irregular troops, irregular forces, irregular operations, and so forth and so on. And something that I had to talk about, the use of the flat bottom boat for landing troops and that sort of stuff. There's so much very important material in there, and I just want to repeat the point that I'm only able to read this very carefully and really squeeze the meaning out of them because I've done this other previous work of slaves in a different environment, on the plantation, in the towns, and so forth and so on, and not invading some other kind of places. One of the areas that I would like to point out to you in which Professor Buckley's work has shone has to do with the discussion which has not yet been exhausted. The discussion of the epidemiological environment of the tropics in relation to the waging of war. So that books like, for example, Mosquito Empire, which is a very wonderful title. I make jokes about that, but the lowly mosquito defeating armies and so on, right? And so forth. That Roger did all this fantastic work on the epidemiological environment, malaria, yellow fever, and so forth and so on. And I kept being envious of his experience reading the kinds of materials that he read, because, I'm one of these historians who actually read footnotes. So I spent a lot of time reading footnotes of where did he get this stuff? Oh my God, that's where it is. So I've got to track that down. But, that's another contribution that I think will stand out, and in the years to come, people will point to the kind of work that he has done. Because a number of scholars came up after Roger began to do that kind of work, Geggles, etc., talking about, the epidemiological environment, which is still important in our studies today. So the overall value of Professor Buckley's work is not simply to me in military history either. The military history that's connected to the epidemiological context and so forth is a a branch of military history that really connects up with medical history. So, you know, that's the kind of stuff, a kind of cross-disciplinary inquiry that's of great use. And Roger has sort of pioneered this, particularly for the Atlantic basin, with an application to societies into which people of African descent were introduced during the years of slavery and the slave trade. I want to suggest also that in another very important way, Roger has made a fundamentally important contribution to an approach to the writing of history, or the thinking about the writing of history, that some of my friends will find perhaps outrageous and maybe too cowardly to want to actually attempt. And that is a sensitivity to fiction and what fiction does for developing or cultivating ways to understand reality. Now, see, the thing is that sometime in the past, when Roger was working on Congo Jack, he told me about that project and so forth. I got very excited. Now, see, it's not because it's my work, it's because it's somebody else's work. I don't have to do this because someone else is doing it. But I understand what they're doing. So if you want to be in conversation with me by email and so on, I'll get into stuff, I'll read your manuscript and so on. I'll make all kinds of obnoxious remarks in the margins and so on, you know, and so forth. And you'll probably have a great time. Because, see, the thing is, when I write history, I'm always aware, and that has been going on since I was in high school, I'm always aware that there are questions about how real is this? Is this what really happened? How can I turn this around and have a different kind of outcome? Suppose, you know, blah, blah, and so on. So I'm always sensitive to the fictional possibilities of my material. Now that really gets me going. Because there's always some kind of voice going on in the back of my head. Say, you can't do that, you know, you can't really fictionalize this stuff. You gotta stay on track and so on. I say, but I mean, I'm trying to find out what's going on in this guy's mind and so on. And the voice says, well, you have to find a way to put this. I said, okay, let's put it as a question then. See, if you put it as a question, then you can work with various types of answers and so forth and so on. So I'm very sensitive to the value of Roger's work in fiction, like Congo Jack, for example. Copies of the book are outside. That in which Roger tries to get into the mind and psychological experiences and realities that impinge on the existence of these folks in the West India regiments and so forth and so on. I mean, you can't help it. You can't write about people living real lives on the surface. You've got to get somewhere more interior. And you've got to take risks to find that out and to provide some answers. But what you do is, as a historian, you might make suggestions as to ways of thinking about stuff, rather than saying this was the case. Say, invite people into this discussion about possibility and so forth. I want to end my comments with an appropriate poem on the Caribbean milieu that Professor Buckley has captured so well in some of his work. Written, the poem that is, not by me, but by my fellow Tibwai, Aimé Ish, child of St. Lucia in the Antilles. I come from St. Lucia. I refer to the poem The Harbor by Derek Walcott, who died last year, taken away, sadly, too soon. Let me just read this word, very short, but I think you'll see what I'm trying to get at. It's called The Harbor. The fishermen, rowing homeward in the dusk, do not consider the stillness through which they move. So I, since feelings drown, should no more ask for the safe twilight which your calm hands gave. and the night, urger of old lies, winked at by stars that sentry the humped hills, should hear no secret fearing forth. Time knows that bitter and sly seem, and love raises walls. Yet others who now watch my progress outward, on a sea which is crueler than any word of love, may see in me the calm my passage makes, braving new water in an antique oaks, and the secure from thinking may climb safe to liners, hearing small rumors of paddlers drowned near stars. For me, that poem captures a lot of what Roger, developing as a scholar and as an intellectual, must have experienced. I'm not saying our experiences are the same, but they're very close in some very interesting kinds of ways. Walcott, I mean, in some ways, his own experience is reflected in the experience of Roger, who worked on different kinds of things. But to read Derek Walcott's poetry is to understand something about the challenges that Roger Buckley faced and succeeded. Thank you. So the Q&A thing is aimed at me?
Yes, and Roger can certainly step in as well. But I like the use of aimed at you as.
This is military stuff. Yeah.
So we have plenty of time for questions, and we'll open it up.
Well, questions, comments, you know, I want to know what people think.
I have a comment or a question. I'm not a writer and I'm not a scholar, but I've read Congo Jack and I fell in love with it 8-9 years ago, to the extent that I was considering changing my career to only try to represent that book to publishers throughout the world. You know, to try to get them to convey to the world how important that book is. But my comment is this. You know, typically, in my opinion, you know, War and Peace is typically one of the longest, at least, you know, historical fiction books. As a historian, when you're writing and thinking about history, Roger clearly in Congo Jack felt the need to fictionalize something. Is that something that historians typically feel or don't feel at all? How often does a historian want to take the history that he knows well and create a fictionalized, dramatic story that is aimed at the heart and the emotions of the reader? How often does that happen?
It happens often. This is what I was trying to say. My own experience was exactly that. When I'm writing history, I'm aware of the fictional possibilities, and you can feel yourself leading in that direction and so forth. But I keep reminding myself that that's a different project. I can do that. I'll do that later on. Right now, I have to deal with people who want to read history and so forth.
Sure.
But if you have the skills, you can write history in such a way that the readers begin to understand the nature of your struggle at that particular point. That has to do with explanation. What are the tools that you use, for example? I said, for example, that what you might use is the form of questioning, the questions that you raise. The questions that you raise can draw the reader into an understanding of the possibilities between fiction and real history.
Sure.
But since you're writing history, let us approach it this way. You see what I'm saying?
Sure.
So I'm not leaving, as a historian, I don't want to leave out the person who wants more of the fictionalization of the whole thing. But I would write in such a way that I address your anxieties and say, not you, I mean, the reader, that, I mean, there are possibilities for this.
You always have to leave it to the imagination of the reader to pick up on it and create it himself.
Right. Yes. You actually lead them into doing that.
Yeah.
Lead the reader into doing this. Because, and I'm glad you used that word imagination. I keep telling my students that this is very important to be a successful history student. Don't leave your mind in the dorm. I mean, you bring your head, but you bring your mind as well. Don't you? And I said, mind and imagination. When I was in high school, I kept thinking about this. How do I become a really good student in social sciences and history in general? And it seemed to me that how I use my imagination is very important. You understand?
Sure.
So, I mean, so classes used to be very tagging. Of course, there were times when I would turn off and my imagination would be somewhere else, in the movies or, and so on. But things that you could do with your mind, I mean, to tell me, for example, that there's a war going on in the Caribbean and there are privateers and pirates, I'm not just learning the facts, I have to think this through, right? And play with images and so on and put it together. So that brings up the question, for example, of movies and so on. One of the things I used to do as a teenager was to try to see, particularly around examination time, whether there were any movies in town which connected with some of the exams that I had to write, imaginatively. So my mind would, be able to, like for example, I mean, novels rendered in the movies like, Oliver Twist and so on, Dickens and so forth. But again, the question about imagination is really very important, both as writer, as reader, and the connection between reader and writer. The effectiveness of the text is going to depend a lot on what happens to the imagination. That conflict, that conveyance between one and the other. But it's always important that in writing fiction, you don't fictionalize it deliberately. So there's stuff like footnotes, for example. Footnotes are supposed to keep you honest. Yes, when you tell people where you found what you found.
Right.
Now, one time I sent an article to Slavery and Abolition, a journal in England, and the editor wrote back and he said, "But wait a minute, your footnotes are longer than your article." I said, "Yes, because you guys may say this is, that's yeah." I said, "This is my sources," and so on. He said, "But this is too long." I mean,
Fred, do you have the comment?
Sure. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I was struck by your comment that the usage of enslaved peoples as military forces was an important episode in the history of irregular troops, irregular forces. So I'm wondering, the standard understandings that we get, for example, in political science, which is my field, is that regular warfare was really a kind of European continental thing, and it really, only strictly speaking, starts with French Revolution, Napoleonic armies, and so forth. So is part of what you're doing kind of challenging that story about what's regular and irregular? Is there something about the irregularity of these troops that are different, for example, than the troops who were resisting the regular armies of the Napoleonic invasions, Spanish partisans and so forth? So that's part of it. And then another part of the question is, was there ever regular warfare in the Caribbean anyways, or does the concept sort of like not really make much sense when we're talking about, say, peoples and pirates and other just forces that don't seem to fit the European continent?
There may be a lot of debate about regular warfare and its description for the European theater and the Caribbean theater. Since, for example, in the European sense, I mean, regular warfare is de rigueur, so to speak. Get on the battlefield, blah, blah, blah. In the Caribbean, I mean, you don't really have that kind of environment. I mean, you talk about heavily wooded islands and so forth and so on. So you're already into a topographical kind of difficulty. So that invites the enemy, therefore, to use, one case would be use a kind of guerrilla tactics. That brings into to play the concept of irregular warfare. And this irregular warfare is not peculiar to the Caribbean either, or, other tropical spaces. It's also emerging effectively in Europe. In fact, a lot of this early discussion has to do with irregular warfare in Europe. And the other say, how can we apply that to, to our conflict with Native Americans in North America, for example, around Braddock's defeat time and so forth and so on. You know, it's very interesting. However, the recruitment of these guys from these slaves from the British Islands to invade the French and Spanish Islands during the 7 Years' War may have added a new twist to the idea and practice of irregular warfare, because these guys were not really meant to fight. So they were meant to do manual labor. But you understand, if you're doing manual labor in an environment that's heavily contested and so forth, you're likely to find yourself wanting to swing not just a basin or a basket or a hoe, but an actual sword or something, right? And so a lot of these slaves who were recruited for manual labor find themselves behind the lines in enemy territory, functioning as scouts, privateers, pioneers, and getting involved and having to come into contact with the enemy. So one of the things I'm looking for is a way to talk about the actual experience of these recruited slaves and new styles of war, perhaps, and new experiences, you know. But, I mean, that's one of the things that you have to do. I mean, you have to work with the material and see what comes out of it. Now, sometimes working with the material may suggest questions for which you don't have answers. Nevertheless, you should pose the question to suggest to the reader your line of thought. You see what I mean? Because, I mean, writing history, it seems to me, is an invitation to the reader. Come into my parlor, you know, said a spider to the fly, and so on. You know, you may not get out, I mean, but, you know, that's the whole thing. But, you know, your question is very interesting, because I remember when I first saw that term, irregular warfare, I thought, whoa. But I also understood that academics play with terms and come up with ways to, you know, talk about reality and the ideas and so on. So if there's irregular warfare, there must be something like regular warfare. So if you know what regular warfare is, you're getting closer to understanding. And the varieties of irregular warfare. And I think those slaves, they have contributed to that. Yeah.
So we have two questions, Sean, and then Greg, you have a question. So Sean, please.
Yeah. Well, my question, it's not really a question, it's a comment on history to fiction, that transition. And this is my hat is off to Roger Buckley. I'm not a historian, I'm a scientist, but I was drawn into this subject of history to fiction because I read a lot. When I read his book on I Hanuman, in the context of the colonial Indian history, I got so much drawn into it. I kept on asking him, is it all history? He said, yeah, it's based on history, but it's fictional. And this, the art that he has, so artistically he transitioned from history to fiction. And a person like me who has I have no background in history, I was drawn so much into it. And since then I have been, you know, a big fan of his writing. And whenever he writes a book, he sends it to me, and I read thoroughly and again try to understand the historical situation and then how it fits with every day-to-day human life and individual, how he brings out the individual emotion. And so thank you so much, Roger, for being so, I'm overwhelmed to appreciate your expression, your writing, particularly on Indian colonial history of India. Based on that part, he wrote two books, I think, yeah, both of the books I read, and I admired him so much and do admire him today. Thank you for being Roger Buckley.
A small comment on this comment, and that is that the big question that arises in my mind is how does anyone write interesting history that can be read for enjoyment or whatever? all information. You see what I'm saying? That's very, very important to all historians. But the corollary question is, how do you write interesting history that is not at the same time fictionalized? That's not what you're supposed to do. You see what I'm saying? So, I mean, so our students go to graduate school expecting that this is going to be plain sailing, no problem. And then they realize, oh, there are strictures, there are rules, regulations, there are things that you cannot do in writing history. And so you just make this thing up. What are your sources? You know, are these sources reliable and so on? I mean, you know, some people may well think that it's impossible to write a single sentence as a historian without busting a gasket or something. Well, let me say this. As a historian, you worry a lot. You worry a lot. Not just about what you've written, but how it's going to be received, what people are going to think. Did you get your meaning across? Oh my God. Have you used the right language, the right images, and so on? Okay, I may not look as dilapidated as you might want to think if I went through that process. That's because I paced myself. And diet and exercise is very important. But you know, also the doctors say. I mean, but I mean, I like your comment because it gets into this question that I was interested in how the experience that you had as you read this, that somehow the alchemy of production, you know, worked to produce this type of response. You see what I mean? There's certain kind of history that you'll find impossible to read. Now, I read anything because there's switches and stuff that you turn off in your head and so on, you know, like Eric Williams used to do with his air. Debates in the House of Assembly and so on. But the tremendous responsibility that rests on a historian when you sit down or stand to write and to communicate actually with your readership. That is, to me, a sacred responsibility. And you have to figure out how to do this. The only way to do that is to develop the skills. Therefore, in graduate school, you know, the program needs to work on that sort of stuff. It doesn't mean that because you can write a novel that you can be a good historian either. It doesn't mean that. Now, this is getting very exciting. Very interesting because, I mean, you know, I'm involved in my own head with these types of issues and so forth. So I know, for example, well, I mean, I'm writing about these slaves that my friend just mentioned here. I will move from that to talk about, during that same period, the privateering war where we have people raiding each other's ships, interrupting trade and that kind of stuff and so on. And what is going to happen is that I will then get a better sense of the individuals, the people, the experiences, the different classes of people during the 7 Years' War. And then the third book would be, I mean, a conversation of an interface between, let us say, one of these slaves, you know, and a privateer. And the privateer, what he decides to do, he decides he wants to hire this slave who has been somewhere else and has come back to the island being sick, but he now feels better. And now he wants to recruit him to work on this privateer ship. Say, you can make some money, you know. Really. By the way, I just made this up as I'm standing here. as an idea for a book. I mean, it may happen, it may not, but I mean, that's the way it works. Yeah.
As an outsider, I'm not a historian again, you know, in my opinion, fiction makes history more powerful. Because fiction talks about individual feeling, individual situation under that particular history. Otherwise, you don't see it. You see that overall thing, okay, this is happening, people are coming, slaves, and, you know, this is how history. History is not that attractive to me in person, but, you know, but if it's, when you talk about individual, that how it affected human being,
Right.
then when it becomes very interesting.
So when I finish that book that I'm writing, I'll send it to you because one of the things I've been doing in my research and writing is to concentrate on the individual as a way of individualizing what might appear to be a macro great large, extensive experience. Because the slaves are different people, different circumstances, they belong to different masters and so forth and so on. And, oh God, I mean, this thing about research is very, very difficult. You're trying to finish this book and you're trying to get all this material. But if, as I agree with you, you want to get this to be very interesting, you've got to pay attention to the micro picture. The micro picture, individuals, institutions, individuals, isolated situations that may occur and so forth. These isolated cases or situations may also be used to open up some questions about the broader picture. I'm talking about techniques of writing that you've got to suffer through, and you've got to read a lot of stuff that people attempt to do which doesn't work. And you try to figure out what's the problem here. If you had done it differently, it might have worked. So how does a graduate student get trained in the history program? That's a very good question. I mean, do you teach a student how to write? Because, I mean, that's part of what I hear saying here. I mean, there must be something like the effective and the ineffective historian. The historian that reaches no one, and the historian that does.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Greg's been waiting for a while for that, sorry about that, Magdalena. Greg, do you have a question?
No, it's fine. I've been thinking about all the things you say. I have a long-running dialogue with a friend who's a novelist, but who also writes history. I say that historians have a more difficult time because historians have to keep to the facts and novelists can invent what they like. And he says novelists have the harder time because we have to make it plausible. And historians can write about reality even when it's unimaginable. But I think that it's a false dichotomy. First of all, he writes about the connections between history and literature. He wrote a book called The Art of History where he compares, for example, David McCullough's The Path Between the Seas and Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Love in Time of Cholera. But I think that what you've been saying about the biographical element is a very important thing. Already in history departments, there are people who look down on biography as being a cheap form of history. And I think that the macro versus the micro element is very important. What are the tools required for doing biography that are different from the tools required for large-scale history?
They're not that different. They're not that different. I think what one has to bear in mind is the objective, the goals that are involved, and how can you get there with least cost to your mind and so forth, and your credibility and so forth. But following an earlier remark of yours, I mean, to me, issues of plausibility are very, very important to the story. Because when I'm writing history, I don't know whether I developed the skill from, but I am carrying several explanations in this one head at the same time. You see what I'm saying? But I want to make a point, you see, that sounds plausible. And I make it clear that I'm talking about plausibility. I do not know. I have no problem with that. Telling people I don't know. I like doing this as cocktail parties. Because people assume that I've read everything, I say, I know I haven't read it. I mean, it's not always true, but yeah, but plausibility, it forces you to accept the challenge that people may call you out on certain types of interpretation, right? Of course, what is really uncomfortable is after you finish writing the article or the book, you say to yourself, I mean, right after you finish writing, you say, wait a minute, I could have said this differently, I could have written a different paper. Oh, gee. I mean, you set it off, okay, go. You set it off anyhow. And see what the editor says. But I always have the alternative paper in my mind. The other position that one can take. Now, one way to write stuff, of course, if you're using individual, is to take a point of view of a particular individual. That's a style of writing history. If you have those persons' papers and so on, you can get into that. Yeah, and I would say that as a historian, you have to be courageous enough not to be afraid of being wrong or people disagreeing with you. You see what I'm saying? Oh, yeah. In writing my first book on the 1736 plot in Antigua, now this is a slave plot, right? Nobody actually gets killed revolting and so forth and so on. So I was in the Caribbean, Christmas time, writing chapter 3. And my friends wanted to know what I was doing. So when I told them about it, they said, "You mean you're writing a book about something that didn't really happen?" At this point, I wanted to give it up. Writing about the plot per se, and using the plot to get into how the society worked. To me, this was a much better challenge, intellectual challenge, than a simple, than a plot, which is 5 chapters. The book turned out to be 11 chapters. Can you imagine that? I mean, by chapter 9, I said, "Oh God, 2 more to go." I mean, it's really tough.
So we have, as to take us home, will be Magdalena.
Dr. Buckley humanizes history. And he makes history and he writes history in a way that the average person can access it. We live in a nation that is not interested in history, clearly, by the behaviors that we are exhibiting now, because we're not learning shit from it. And what Roger has done with history is he has made it in such a way, these are cinematic masterpieces waiting to happen. So I want to address you in terms of cross-pollination with those of you who have the privilege of academia, who have the privilege of your institutions. Within your institutions, there are film schools, or you have access to those film schools. I want to suggest, how do we take Dr. Buckley's work to a larger audience where it can reach the average person like me? I am not an academic. I'm a working class woman. How do you take Roger's work? Can you do it? Do you have the privilege? 6 degrees of separation. We all have contacts, we all know people, and sometimes we don't think about our assets. So assess your assets. And do you know a film school that would be able to take on, for example, Congo Jack and turn it into the film that it deserves to be, so that people like me can see it on the screen and learn something about history in a way that humanizes it? So can we go to bat for Roger?
Thank you so much. So we'll take a brief break, and we're already on time. This is the most glorious day. All right, so
People always keep great stuff.
She also rails against the denigration of darker-skinned women and the privileging of whiteness in her own culture. In Sepoy O'Connor, the native soldiers referred to as bloody niggers are restricted from associating with the white officers in the same space of the mess hall, and the Indian servant, although colorfully clad, is entirely invisible to the white men. Sergeant Major Wingate tells Daniel, quote, "We would beat them within an inch of their lives back then if they even dared to enter our rooms without permission," unquote. Sergeant Major Ashford seconds this by saying that the man's Indian name is too long to pronounce and, quote, "he doesn't count. He's here, but he's not really here. He's invisible. Do you follow me? We think of them, the Indian orderlies, as furniture," unquote. Viewed collectively as a despised dark-skinned majority over whom the minority white race must rule, it is no wonder that the soldiers and their women feel the, quote, "shame and loathing," unquote, that is projected upon them in the dominant narrative. Being trapped in the dominant worldview, racist discourse, and socio-political system that oppresses them, Buckley's protagonists struggle within a system that is not only materially enforced by institutions and weapons, but also by discourses that shapes the world they inhabit. Becoming the subjects of their own destiny is a challenging transformation that is complex, ongoing, incomplete, and brutal. And lastly, my 4th point, the historian's positionality, freedom and the challenge of interpretation. In his final novel, Freedom, as yet unpublished, Buckley addresses the issue of the historian's role in interpreting the evidence, making moral judgments, and imagining the past. In effect, we return to a question raised at the outset of this paper. To what degree can the historian claim objectivity and value-free authorial oversight over his narration of history? Taking as his subject the Indian Legion's 1942 creation and defection from the British Army in World War II to its capture by the Allies in 1945, his collaboration with Axis powers to oppose the British in the hope of receiving assistance from the Nazis for the campaign to liberate India from British rule, and Subhash Chandra Bose's alliance with Hitler for this project, Buckley has woven an intriguing tale of the McGill historian Ralph Coggins coming into possession of original papers and photographs about a Sikh fighter in the Legion, Harpreet Singh, through another historian, Minnie Maninder Cormier, who it turns out has a secret motive for transferring these documents to him. She is the daughter of Singh and Helga, his German lover, who was saved by Yadav, a fellow fighter, or fathers who sent her accounts of her father's life and the Legion's mission. By sharing her large personal archive with Coggins, Professor Cormier wishes to, quote, to resurrect the Indian Legion from the dustbin of history, unquote, and to exonerate it and the reputation of her father from the accusation that they were quislings and Nazi sympathizers. She aims to convince Coggins to portray them in his forthcoming book on the Legion as freedom fighters for the Indian nationalist cause, and to restore their honor and good standing in the annals of posterity. The novel's time frame moves between the past and the present, recreating the wartime scenes that Coggins reads about in the letters and the couple he sees on the photos, demonstrating the professor's imagination at work in reconstructing the past. As he reads, he becomes moved, often to the point of tears, and wonders about what secrets the faces cannot tell, what else might be hidden in these people's lives that he will never know. Buckley shows how the historian's imagination creatively enters into this process of engaging with the source materials and documents, and that it is not a dispassionate involvement with the subject. In his imagination, the past enters the present and comes alive to the point that the dead are living and continue to live in narrative time. The past and present are not strictly separate worlds, as Michel Rolfe-Trouillot has argued, considering the many controversies over historical representation of past events and persons that continue into our day and have drawn historians into the fray, often against their inclination. In Buckley's novel, the professional historian is compelled to struggle with moral judgments, with interpreting and evaluating the events and actors under consideration. Sometimes this is very difficult, as it is apparently in the case of the Indian Legion, which, in changing the Legion from the Allied to the Axis side of the conflict, opens itself to condemnation for collaboration with one of modern history's most evil regimes perpetrating genocide on a massive scale. The historian is shown to struggle with different viewpoints on the matter and imagines a conversation or debate between Malcolm X and Gandhi. He explores various possible angles from which the soldier's decision to defect could be viewed, and if the end ever justifies the means. It seems that Coggins would agree with Dante's statement, the hottest place in hell is reserved for those who remain neutral. The verdict of history carries with it serious consequences, yet the historian cannot abdicate his responsibility to make judgments and offer motives or causes for what transpired. At least this is what Coggins concludes in his search for truth, even as he wonders if finding the truth is possible. He, however, must cast his ballot, and this he does at the end of the novel. He has made his judgment and is willing to stand behind it. And here I will not give away the plot's ending. I think that this tells us that in engaging with the problematic issues, past or present, the historian is not an objective, absolute moral judge. As Peter Hoffer writes in Historians Confront the Problem of Evil, quote, such universal and detailed knowledge is beyond the historian's ken. It may be in God's mind, but it will never be in ours. We must content ourselves with the recognition that we have chosen a field of study that will sometimes make us almost unutterably sad, and at other times shaking with fury, unquote. Suffice it that he is engaged subjectively with mind and heart intellect and emotion, imaginatively and conceptually, and in the end he must come to his own conclusions and be willing to give an account of them. At the end of the novel, Coggins does precisely that. Freedom, in addition to exploring familiar ground to Buckley's readers, foregrounds the historian's positionality in crafting of his texts. As I have attempted to show, this process is a fourfold one of reclaiming, constructing, interpreting, and imagining the past, which Roger Buckley has eminently succeeded in doing. Thank you.
So we'll open it up for questions, comments. Jason.
Yeah. So, sort of coming back to our previous conversation, this I would categorize this as not dull. Partially, you know, I say that because what I think you're pointing out, both with the work that you're doing in interpreting Roger's work, and also Roger, the writing of fiction, is that you can have, well, I think what defines it is writing without purpose, right? So you can recount facts historically without having any meaning behind it, right? But then also a narrative without meaning also isn't a compelling story, right? And so
It's not just a collection of facts
right,
going along.
right.
Oh, we have to get
Yeah.
just look at the plot.
And so, you know, as you're talking, you know, and describing his work, I was hoping you could comment too, Roger, also about the way that creativity isn't just that you're pulling things out of thin air, but that it comes from a conceptual understanding of how gender operates under certain constraints, or the theories of racial formation, and that as historians we get traces of these things in the archive, and the archive is never complete, right? And so that theory helps to fill in those gaps, and that the imagination is enriched by social theory and gives it these anchors that then make it compelling because it connects to our own experience and historical fact. So I'm also curious about your interpretation of his work and through performative work too, and that kind of interpretation as well.
Maybe what do you mean performative?
I thought one of the introduction, the adaptation.
Oh, well, I was just very inspired by Congo Jack, and then some years later when I was on vacation, I was just really inspired. I was resting and I just started to write it, and it came out, and I think that shows the ability of one imagination to ignite another person's imagination, and that when, you know, happens a lot in the world, when somebody reads a book, you never know what it can spark in that person and how it can stimulate further creative outpourings, you know. We won't judge whatever quality they are, but nevertheless it shows that one person's passion and imagination can be like a flame that then continues to burn in other people's souls, and they take it from there, and that's how it is, you know. But of course, I can hear from people's questions and responses all day so far that they've been very touched by the books Buckley has written, and that's a free play of imagination, you could say. Yeah.
Greg, did you want to follow up?
But in terms of the question of, you know, can the subaltern speak?
Yes.
How through literature one gets at the subaltern's voice. It reminds me of the controversy around William Styron's Confessions of Nat Turner.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, both from Roger and from you, whether you could, what lessons one can draw from that episode, and whether that forms a cautionary tale or forms an inspiration.
I didn't come here to work, so I'm going to let you go.
I'm sorry, I have to admit I have not read that, I can't comment to it, that one. But I would say that people who write novels, whether they're historical novels or not, but if they represent subaltern identities, as I have said, it's in the representation that the issue is situated, right? If they are presented as a homogenized, essentialist identity, and in that case, it would be, I think, a misrepresentation. But when they are imagined with diversity, with the recognition that it isn't just a totalizing category, then in fiction, of course, you can pick up as a writer identities that you yourself have not lived, or nobody would write about anything, right? Just as people who write about kings and queens or elites, right? They have to enter into a process of engaging with knowledge about them, but also take it as a springboard to further fabricate. As I said, in writing of history, though, I don't believe, I personally don't believe that counterfactual narratives, as they're called, or writing counterfactual narratives is entirely honest, because readers may not know if those narratives are blurring or else totally erasing the distinction between what actually happened and what has been invented and added to it, you know. But to the point I was addressing here in the representation of previously marginalized, oppressed, underrepresented groups, people on social margins who are, as I said, not by essence, not essentially that, but they have been discursively constructed as such, and then through institutional processes placed there. And then they have to engage in the process of reclaiming their agency and their empowerment. And then that is a struggle I tried to show, both internal, psychological, to overcome an alienated form of consciousness from power, and it has to be often engaged in, as Buckley shows, through warfare, through military engagement, through physical resistance of some kind. And in the case of, three of the novels, the protagonists do choose to do that and to break with former identity constructions.
Well, just to build on Greg's question, because, I think that part of the issue, the controversy around that text is the historical moment in which it's produced, right? Like, it comes right, in the wave of the civil rights movement, and the argument is, how can somebody who is not from that particular subject position write that particular history? I think that is like, kind of a huge part of the controversy, right? And you do see a reimagination of what that looks like by Kyle Baker, who does a graphic narrative about Nat Turner. And it's completely without words. And I think that, that's kind of an interesting response to how that is a work in which Styron actually speaks for his subject as opposed to speaking with, right? And that kind of brings me to Roger's body of work. And one of the things that really strikes me is, it's published at a particular moment. It's published after there has been some paradigmatic shifts that are occurring within humanities, looking at alternative voices, alternative future, like kind of histories. So there's something to that, but there's also an intimacy to the trilogy that kind of gets at what Lisa Lowe recently articulated in the Intimacies of Four Continents, is this notion of a past conditional temporality. What if we actually, and an example of this is, what if we didn't just look at the coolie trade as something that occurred alongside the Pacific or like through the Atlantic, but if we look at it in tandem with what was happening with the displacement of native peoples, or what was happening in terms of the colonization of the African continent. Then we start looking, and it goes back to an earlier point about the strangeness of where certain documents are found in archives. You realize that there was an intimacy to like imperial conquest that we normally do not recognize, right? And I think that intimacy is something that is very much part of Roger's work, and makes it, does that make sense? I mean, does that cohere with your reading of his work?
Yes, I think so. Well, that there is it's intimacy because there is what I was saying earlier, the empathy factor there too, and there is the grounding in the knowledge base. It isn't fluff drawn out of air too. And also want to say something about that's the point. Can people who are not of a particular ethnicity speak for those people? Many years ago, sometime in the 80s, I went to a conference in Montreal, and it was a Native panel, and there was a speaker called Lee Miracle, and she is a Métis writer. And she was very angry at that time, it seemed, and she said, white women should not write at all about us. We should not write about Métis people or about Native people. And that hit a raw nerve with other people who, for example, really enjoyed and felt were very moved by famous Canadian writers who talked in their books about Native people and Métis. And particularly one person I'm very familiar with, Margaret Lawrence, who had a very good Métis friend, another artist, Maria Campbell. And Margaret Lawrence wrote about the Africans, and indeed her first novels and short stories were all set in places she had lived and had intimately experienced relationship with Africans in Somalia and in Ghana. And the first phase of her career is the African fiction, and her characters are so the question of representation came up. Can she accurately represent these people because she is not an African, right? And then when she wrote about her, her Canadian books, especially her last big one, The Diviners, again, she represented Métis people. And I know after that some Aboriginal writers protested, but I think they were going through that phase. I haven't heard anything about that more recently, so as you say, I think they're like that historical moment. There was that time when people felt, no, if you're not part of us, you can't represent us. So it's
well, and just the one last thing I'll say is, to put Roger on the spot, even though he didn't want to work. I mean, I know that he had at one point in a conversation we had, in some ways, the trilogy writes back to Kipling, right? And kind of writes back to Kim. And, I'm wondering, and so I'm just going to ask, does it matter that, something we haven't talked about is that your body of work is very much intimately tied to a familial history, right? That is born out of migration, interconnectivity, intimacy, etc. I mean, is that why did you tell me that?
What did I tell you these stories?
No, you told me that about Kipling and Kim. Do you remember this?
Oh, well, I.
It's like The Empire Writes Back, kind of.
Kind of that thing, yeah, like The Empire Writes Back, that kind of discourse, but
I don't know that I remember that.
It was.
That conversation. I do know that in the Irish Soldier book, O'Connor breaks with that tradition and doesn't say his identity with the British Army anymore, or his Irish path, but he has a new identity, and that was Indian. But I'm trying to remember that conversation. I know it came up someplace, and probably came up with us. I have to admit that these questions are quite deep, and I never thought of any of these things. The only thing I knew I better get in there is gender. Let me get gender in there, because if I don't, but it was more than that. They were historical examples of women taking these kinds of role in the Caribbean, not so much in Ireland that I knew of, but also in India. So I wasn't conscious, and we talked this morning about subconscious, what's going on in my subconscious when I read. I think what I was motivated by curiosity, truth, and also rage.
Like the fury, sometimes a historian has fury.
And this is not the kind of answer that you want, but so I write these things, and I I see a need for it, and it's more or less the questions that I'm raising, because in the novel, in the 3 novels, and I'm not sure that answering the question, what surprised me was the British were recruiting men from increasingly politicized groups. There were troubles with the Irish. Yet some people claim that it's the Irish who won India. All of these English regiments were filled with Irishmen. India was always at odds with the British, all kinds of mutinies, and of course the big one was 1857. And the Caribbean has a long tradition of marinage, marinage running away and also fighting. And so I was not alert to these deeper questions, but to find out, was there this discontent? Could there be? And maybe this is the question with Kipling, because Kipling gives you this picture of Soldiers 3 and all these other, ballot room ballards. So these guys were just happy-go-lucky, and particularly the Irish guys, drinking and killing and all of this and like that. And yet they were coming from Ireland, which was under the heel of the British. So these deeper questions, I don't know that I thought about. The one thing that I know that I did think about was, or 2 things was, to try to reclaim any voices that may have been there, and I found them. And so it was not, as Kipling would have us believe, that these armies, at least in India, were happy-go-lucky guys, just get them drink and so forth. And then the question of gender. I saw that in my Caribbean history when I taught Caribbean history. Juba Lily and Congo Jack. I don't know if you call them revolutionaries, but they were there. And they were Indian freedom fighters who were women. And the most famous one is the Rani of Jhansi.
Yeah.
Anybody know about her? So now, were there thousands of them? I don't know. But that's where the record goes cold. And it was a way really only to challenge the traditional narrative, and maybe it will end with that. And that's why, and I'm not answering Greg's question, or Jason's, but I had no idea of these sorts of things. And then this morning, Angelica and I were talking about where the wellspring of this stuff. Where, and the subconscious and all of this stuff and so forth. And then on your question about how could I write these things? I think I was talking to Barry, how presumptuous of me to think I could get into the mindset of a stolen African. I mean, what is this? I mean, I felt that about it. Who am I that I could be talking about these people? I mean, and I always felt really uncomfortable with that. All of these men, and so forth. So it was just a question of race, but what would make me think that I could do this? And I went and did it anyway. Because I knew that there were those voices the other side of the hill. And I didn't believe that, as Kipling and others stated, that these colonial armies, and of course, well, then they blew up, like the Seaports Mutiny was the largest attack on European colonization in the 19th century. And there were a lot of other things going on in India. So I just went hunting for these other voices. And so that's what my goal was. And then the other question of gender. I knew that I better do that or else I was going to get in trouble. But then I began to dig and so forth, and I felt that I was satisfied that. But there were people who wanted to question this because there's so few voices. But then these peasant soldiers and so forth. But Shamistra knows this. In Dr. Rochovi, excuse me, that you've got to be careful of these peasants because they're shrewd and they get people to write letters for them, as in the Indian Army in the First World War. So I didn't want to think, oh, because it's a peasant, he doesn't know anything. And like dressing up this Indian soldier, dressing up as Lord Hanuman, completely covered as the monkey god of India, the tail and all of this business and the whiskers and so forth. And so the rage comes in, I like to think that there was a sense of nationalism in India because you mentioned Philip Mason. He said that Indians had no sense of nationalism until the Second World War. But I said that there were other things joining them, and it was their culture which superseded the limitations of language. And all kids in India knew the story of the Ramayana. They knew the story of Rama and Sita and Hanuman. They all knew that story. And maybe so there is a cultural unity of India, if not a political one, because we think of political unity based upon religion, which can't be, based upon language, of course, India cannot be. All of the thousands or hundreds of languages spoken there. So I think I was just high.
And that is a perfect point to end on. I think that is the best point. I was just high. I was just high.
And don't get caught up with these deep questions that Greg and then Jason asked, because I knew we were going to get that. And this morning, and then you confounded me more about the subconscious and where does this come from and how it is manifested in the writing. And I'm saying, wow, I don't think about that. I hate to say it like that,
but I do
there's some
like
things
it.
I
Yeah, I mean, you did invoke. You were just high. So let's actually thank our last speaker, that Roger we are
convinced.
So I know that we're getting to the end of the day, and you notice that there is no break, but I would encourage you to have some berry water. And Greg, do you need PowerPoint and all? Okay, excellent. So we are actually down to our last speaker, the ever wonderful Greg Robinson, who's a native New Yorker and a professor of history at the University of Quebec. In Montreal. His first monograph, By Order of the President, FDR and the Internment of Japanese Americans, Harvard University Press 2001, is an in-depth history of the decisions behind the government's mass removal and confinement of West Coast Japanese Americans during World War II. It spent 4 months on Academia Magazine's University Press bestseller list, and was voted a recommended book for understanding civil liberties by the American Association of University Presses. His second solo book, A Tragedy of Democracy, Japanese Confinement in North America, Columbia University Press 2009, was the winner of the 2009 History Book Prize for the Association of Asian American Studies. It is an ambitious transnational history of the wartime confinement of people of Japanese ancestry throughout North America. It not only offers newly uncovered material that extends existing accounts of camp experience of the West Coast Japanese Americans, but breaks new ground by studying those events alongside the treatment of ethnic Japanese in Canada, a project that we've heard that Roger is pursuing, Mexico and Latin America. Especially noteworthy is the book's discussion of the condition of Japanese Americans under martial law and military government in Hawaii. Professor Robinson's most recent solo work, After Camp, Portraits in Mid-Century Japanese American Life and Politics with University of California Press 2012, is the first full-length book to discuss the experience of Japanese Americans across the continent in the years following World War II. And another new book, gosh, this is exhausting, Greg, but another new book, Pacific Citizens, Larry and Guyo Tajiri, and Japanese American Journalism in the World War II Era with University of Illinois Press that same year, is an anthology of writings by a pair of insightful Nisei journalists and extends an extended biographical and historical introduction. It features an extended biographical and historical introduction and headnotes. Before I turn it over to Professor Robinson, one thing to note is that one of Roger's legacies is the fact that he was prescient enough to have an annual day of remembrance to commemorate and contemplate the legacy of the passage of Executive Order 9066, which paved the way for mass Japanese American internment and incarceration. And actually, it's fitting that we kind of come to a close with this because this is part of Roger's new research project, but also Dr. Robinson served as a lecturer for a day of remembrance, I believe, was it?
Twice, 2003 and then 2013.
So we'll bring you back every 10 years. So without further ado, let's welcome Greg.
discourage Kathy, but in fact there's another book called The Great Unknown,
Oh,
which is
no.
a set of Japanese American portraits from Japanese American history. Actually, Roger is not impressed by any of this. He was only impressed by me because I wore a suit today. I was asked to say something about Roger's contributions in terms of the study of wartime Japanese incarceration. I will be discussing his sphere of research in terms of Japanese Canadians, but first I wanted to speak briefly about how his interest reflects his gifts as a teacher and as an inspiration. Somebody whom I can say without irony for once is somebody who's interested in doing right. I've long been struck by this, and fittingly with Roger, it's literature that I turn to. I was thinking of Terence Rattigan's famous play, The Winslow Boy, in which a family fights after a 12-year-old boy is unjustly accused of stealing and is expelled from his school, and his family makes great sacrifices in order to vindicate him. But interestingly, the family's victory in court is not only not presented, it's just sort of portrayed off stage. And what is portrayed on stage is the play's most powerful moment when it's revealed that Sir Robert Morton, who is the family barrister, who's been portrayed as rather a cold fish, is revealed to have wept openly in court on hearing the verdict. And when he's asked to explain how that is, he explains the reaction, "I wept today because right had been done." It's easy to do justice, very hard to do right. We can discuss the reasons just why this is. For one thing, to do right, you have to know what is right. And then you have to be able to have the courage of your convictions to follow it. And then, even while you're following it, you have to keep from going crazy. And Roger is an interesting study in this because he has been such an outspoken and powerful advocate for people who have no voices. And one of my most interesting things about this is his service as a public intellectual. I found to give some idea of his commitment, I can't resist citing his 2009 testimony to the Appropriations Committee of the Connecticut State Legislature, which was actually posted online. They're not really used to progressive activists named Buckley in Connecticut. But here I'm going to quote him, and I hope I can't get his voice quite right, but I'll do like this. "No examination of the history of immigration law, citizenship, property, and civil rights would be complete without studying the impact of Asian Americans. Should anyone doubt this claim, consider the body of law generated by district courts and the Supreme Court regarding the illegal incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans in American-styled concentration camps during World War II. In my view, this unlawful imprisonment of virtually the entire Japanese American community was the greatest violation of civil rights in 20th century America, bar none. And yet, I am sad to say, most Americans are ignorant of the internment of Japanese Americans. This includes residents of the state of Connecticut. This is an unmitigated national embarrassment that points a bony finger at the educational system and political environment in this country. So when we talk about courage, when we talk about leadership, when we talk about reaching out to give a voice, that's what we're talking about with Roger. I first met Roger over 15 years ago in the spring of 2002. At that time, I was a young scholar. I just finished my PhD. And in the previous months, I'd been hired for a position by my current university in Montreal and had just moved up to Canada. Meanwhile, I published my first book by order of the President on Franklin Delano Roosevelt's responsibility for Executive Order 9066 and the wartime removal and confinement of 120,000 Japanese Americans, often, if inaccurately, called the internment. I was invited to attend a conference held at Boston University on the transnational connections between blacks and Asians. And I was particularly intrigued by the unknown part of Executive Order 906, which was precisely the outstanding opposition of African Americans to mass removal of Japanese Americans and the coalitions and alliances that came between blacks and Asians because of it. I discovered that black activists such as Hugh Macbeth, Paul Robeson, George Schuyler, Langston Hughes, and Erna P. Harris, among others, had spoken up for Japanese Americans. We can talk about this more later if you like, but Roger was the one who kindly agreed to chair the panel on which he was, and I was gratified when he told the audience that he had been fascinated by this same question of tracing African American responses to the mass removal of Japanese Americans. Now, I'd already heard of Roger from Bruce Stave, my late friend who was a professor of history at UConn. Bruce told me that Roger Buckley had instituted a day of remembrance and dialogue at UConn to commemorate the Japanese American experience, and that he'd already brought in speakers who had been themselves confined during the war. He wasn't just treating it as a matter of history, but as a matter of public record. However, this is my first time actually meeting him. I found Roger utterly unpretentious, and I was pleased by his genuine interest in helping mentor young scholars. I think also we had a common connection to Montreal to bring us together. Roger, after all, had received his PhD from McGill University and had lived and taught in Montreal for 9 years before coming to UConn. In the process, we hit it off, and I gladly accepted his offer to keep up connections. Anyhow, as time came on and I came into contact with people who had studied or worked with Roger, they confirmed my impression of him. For me, as a non-Asian entering Asian American studies, I was interested in the connections he was able to make between Asian Americans and Asian American studies in other fields, whether it's African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, the international dimension of his research, and his influence, as evidenced by the extraordinary leadership he showed by cultivating his relationship with Fred Ho and getting Fred Ho's papers for UConn and bringing in Fred Ho's extraordinary connections. Since that first meeting, Roger has helped in many different ways to push me in my career with his colleagues, with the students in his courses on Japanese Americans in World War II, and with the people he talks to. And I should tell Roger that every time he good-mouths me behind my back, it gets back to me. He invited me to lecture, as I mentioned, in 2003 at UConn for the Day of Remembrance, and then in 2012. Last year I came once again, and Roger invited me to speak on Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians. And I also corresponded with him about the questions of martial law in Hawaii and habeas corpus. But while I'm flattered, of course, by his interest in my work, my regard for Roger really reflects the impressive amount of time he spends in building knowledge outside of the ivory tower and making connections, especially as concerns the incarceration of Japanese Americans. In addition to offering this course multiple occasions, he's held DOR ceremonies and assisted middle schools on National History Day. At the Asian American Studies Center here, he helped create a resource library. He even was very eager when I tried to get the papers of Kathleen Tamagawa, the first Japanese American writer, for the UConn library. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. But in terms of Roger's research, of course, I'm waiting to hear how he develops his subject on Japanese Canadians in Montreal, which is the subject that he's now embarked upon and which is very near to my heart. But why is this so important? For not just for me, but for everybody. I think in his teaching and in his research too, Roger proposes a transnational view. You know, US scholars, and particularly historians, are so wrapped up in the idea of American exceptionalism, that America is so different from, the United States is so different from everybody else. But to take a transcontinental view, of course Canada being the closest and the other Anglo society is particularly close, but the Caribbean, Mexico, South America, it enables us to understand what phenomena are actually specific to the United States and which are more broadly American. So the subject of Japanese internment, internationally especially, can give us insight into the nature of government action and also the constraints on decision makers. For example, the Roosevelt administration and the Army in the United States justified mass removal of 120,000 Japanese and confinement of 120,000 Japanese Americans on the grounds of military necessity. And even in later years, there have been what I call internment deniers who have seized on this as the justification for Japanese American removal. Well, in Canada, the chief military authorities, the chiefs of staff of the Canadian Army and Navy, judged that there was no such danger, and the biggest threat was to Japanese Americans from mobs in case of mass action. Well, as we know, in Canada, it happened anyway. So how can it be possible that Japanese Americans posed a military threat sufficient to justify arbitrary action against citizens, while in Canada their counterparts were harmless and everybody was racist? Obviously, it doesn't work that way. that the military justification is a fraud, and in fact, the same forces from operating from the West Coast in particular operated in the United States. I don't wish to belabor this subject. I wrote a whole book called The Tragedy of Democracy about this continent-wide comparison, and I'll take the liberty of referring you to it for further discussion. But even within this larger, complex history of Americas, Montreal is unique, partly because it is both American and not American. Quebec is a borderland. 1/3 and possibly 1/2 of Quebec's population moved to the United States during the long 19th century, and what they brought back, whether it's baseball or American food or movies, greatly influenced Quebec's culture. And then when Prohibition came to the United States, African Americans moved to Montreal, worked in music, and deeply shaped Montreal's, not only its entertainment culture, but its civic culture. There are all sorts of ways in which we can say that Montreal both is and is not the United States. And also because the question of Japanese Canadians in Montreal shows more than anything else, I think, the importance of religion in discussing the fate of minorities. So to give you a little background, Japanese immigrants began settling in Canada in large numbers at the turn of the 20th century. The vast majority settled in British Columbia, but after anti-Asian riots in the Chinese community and the Japanese community in 1907, the Canadian government, like the US government, negotiated a so-called gentleman's agreement by which they halted Japanese immigration to Canada. During the 1920s, the number of legal immigrants was reduced from 400 per year to 150. Meanwhile, a few elite Japanese settled in Montreal. For example, Mr. Shaw T. Nishimura arrived in 1900 as a representative of the Japan Central Tea Association. And in 1897, K.T. Takahashi, the first English-language Japanese North American writer, published a pamphlet called An Appeal from a Threatened Persecution, in which he advised British Columbia whites to hire Japanese immigrants instead of hiring Americans. Of course, the Americans take your money and go back to America, whereas the Japanese want to stay in Canada and help build the country. There are others. There's a circus family, the Ogawas, a circus strongman who married an Irish woman and raised a family of mixed-race Japanese. And then there's a trio of cousins, and there's Saburo Hayakawa, the uncle of the famous scholar and later politician S.I. Hayakawa, who moved to Montreal in the 20s. S.I. Hayakawa got his master's at McGill, supported himself by driving a taxi in Montreal, and then went to the US for his PhD. He went back to Canada after he got his PhD, but he was unable to find a job. Nevertheless, he retained his contacts with Montreal, and his brother Fred remained in Montreal throughout the decades. In any case, the Hayakawas in turn brought in H.S. Kobayashi, a Canadian Army World War I veteran. His daughter, Betty Kobayashi, later Betty Kobayashi Issenman, attended McGill in the late 1930s. As the daughter of a Japanese father and a Jewish mother, she threw herself into anti-fascist activities, and in fact recommended a boycott of Japan over its invasion of China. Dave Suboda joined the Canadian Army from Montreal after Canada declared war on Nazi Germany in 1939, and later participated in the ill-starred raid on Dieppe in 1942. But in any case, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor led to pressure from the Pacific coast, and in response to the pressure, the Prime Minister of Canada issued an order in council in January, several weeks before Executive Order 9066, exiling all males of Japanese ancestry to road labor camps in the interior of the country. This halfway measure only inflamed public opinion by persuading them that there was a threat, and public and officials in British Columbia obtained from the federal government on February 24th another order in council banning all people of Japanese ancestry from the Pacific coast. The order led to the expulsion of 22,000 Canadian Japanese, of whom 60% were Canadian-born people. 70% of the Canadian-born were under 21 years of age. So the families were initially separated as able-bodied men were sent to road labor camps and women and children were brought down to a holding center in Vancouver in preparation for being sent to camps in the east of British Columbia. After mass action by Nisei, who demanded family relocation on the American model, the Canadian government finally agreed, but at the price of several hundred Japanese being arrested as enemy aliens and prisoners of war and being sent to an internment camp in Petawawa, Ontario. The rest of the families were sent to old mining villages in the east of British Columbia, where they were housed in abandoned shacks or sent to sugar beet farms or put in self-supporting settlements. All of the Japanese Canadians who were moved were forced to spend their own money. The Canadian government obliged them to pay for their own internment, and in order to raise money and to keep them from going back to the West Coast, the Canadian government in 1943 instituted confiscation of all the property of Japanese Canadians, which were sold at low prices, bargain basement prices, to returning veterans. Interestingly enough, the Japanese Canadians were divided by religious affiliation. The Anglicans were sent to one settlement, the United Church, which is the Methodists and Presbyterians and Baptists all together, were sent to another. Buddhists were sent to different settlements, and the Catholics were sent to another settlement. And since the Canadian government refused to pay for high schools for teenagers who had been interned, the different religious groups organized to provide schooling. The Buddhists had no co-religionists outside. They had to take correspondence courses. But the Anglicans and the United Church sent money to open schools in the different settlements and hired Japanese Canadian teachers. The Catholics, in contrast, sent nuns and priests from Quebec, French Canadians, to open Catholic schools in Greenwood. And they not only taught the Japanese Canadian youth, but they encouraged Japanese Canadians to go to Quebec and to settle, particularly Catholics, but also others. So as a result, even the same time, Japanese Canadians, predominantly Nisei, began to leave the camps and to move themselves east. As a result, Montreal's Japanese population, which in the start of the war had been 25, moved to 334 by the end of 1943. This trickle expanded after the Canadian government in 1944 issued an order in council obliging Japanese Canadians to move themselves east of the Rockies. Those who stayed in the camps would be deemed to have agreed to deportation to Japan once the war was over. The Canadian government tried to justify mass deportation by offering money to people who would accept repatriation while making it hard for people who moved east. Nonetheless, a large percentage of Japanese Canadians moved east. Many of them sought to go to Toronto, but Toronto didn't want a Japanese ghetto, and so they closed residence in Toronto to Japanese Canadians without a residence permit, which they weren't going to give very easily. As a result, many Japanese Canadians moved on, and Montreal reached a Japanese population of 1,500 by the end of 1946, and up to 1,300 in 1949, making it, as it still is, the largest Japanese population in the French-speaking world. Many of the newcomers discovered that public opinion was less negative against them in British Columbia, and they were able to find jobs in areas such as nursing and public schools. A lot of them were employed in the Jewish community as garment workers and domestics, and lived in Mile End and in the different neighborhoods. They organized their community institutions like the Montreal Japanese United Church and the Montreal Bulletin, their monthly bulletin, which still exists actually. It's still being published. Now it's trilingual. The Quebec government refused, however, to grant the Montreal Buddhist Church or any Buddhist institutions the status of recognized religion, which not only meant they couldn't get tax subsidies, but also meant that since Quebec, Catholic Quebec did not have a civil society, it did not have a civil structure, in order to get married, you had to have a clergyman officiate at your wedding. Thus, Buddhist weddings had to include a priest or a rabbi. The migration of Japanese Canadians triggered new conflict. Most notably in October 1944, McGill College, which had already issued quotas on Jewish students, issued a secret order barring Japanese Canadians on the grounds that since they could not serve in Canada's army, it was useless to educate themselves. Montreal students, both at McGill and elsewhere, swiftly organized resistance. It was the only episode of resistance by non-Japanese Canadians in favor of the rights of Japanese Canadians during World War II. And eventually they got McGill to reverse its ban, although it didn't take effect until after the war. Canon Cyril Powell, an Anglican former missionary, formed the Montreal Committee for Japanese Canadians to help with housing and jobs. And Forrest Laviolette, an American of French-Canadian ancestry who had been a leading scholar of Japanese Americans, organized efforts at McGill to admit Japanese Canadian students, and he later wrote the first book about Japanese Canadians in the war in 1948. But it's the reaction from the French side that's interesting. The Catholic Church proved itself progressive and led the field in support of Japanese Canadians. Mostly it was missionary groups whose mission was in Asia, but who were cut off by the war. So for example, the Sisters of Christ the King opened up a hostel for young Nisei women under the direction of Mother Saint-Pierre. And when Father Jean-Claude Labrec, who had been in Asia, returned to Montreal in 1950, he used his own funds to open the first Japanese community center in Montreal. When that community center grew into a Catholic mission and was opened, the Mission Ibaraki in 1963, the most powerful Catholic cardinal in Canada, Cardinal Léger, the Prince of the Church, gave the opening speech in Japanese. He had been a missionary professor in Japan during the 1930s and spoke very good Japanese. The Nisei interacted daily with French Canadians on the street and in the workplace. I don't have time to give the details. But in any case, the most important aspect of the Japanese Canadian life in Montreal was the struggle against mass deportation. I mentioned that the Order in Council provided that those Japanese Canadians who did not move east would be deported. The Canadian government, as soon as the war was over, began instituting involuntary deportation. In Montreal, representatives of the Nationalist Saint-Jean-Baptiste Society, the YMCA, and the Canadian Jewish Congress sponsored the Montreal Committee on Canadian Citizenship, also known as le Comité pour la défense de la citoyenneté canadienne, under the direction of the famous lawyer and feminist Thérèse Casgrain and Frank R. Scott, the poet and law professor from McGill, to fight deportation. And they helped organize a nationwide movement against involuntary deportation. They eventually took the case to the Canadian Supreme Court and later to the British Privy Council. And while the government in the end prevailed and earned the right, the courts defended the right of the government to deport whom it chose under the War Measures Act, the public opinion had so turned against mass deportation that the Canadian government was forced to abandon its policy. In the years after World War II, as first Toronto and later the Pacific Coast were finally reopened to Japanese Canadians. You know, Vancouver and the Pacific Coast were closed to Japanese Canadians until 1949. And even after that, most of them, because their belongings had been sold off, had nothing to go back to. So they stayed in Quebec. Although Quebec society remained unfamiliar to them and their lack of French fluency limited their business prospects, the majority preferred to stay in their adopted city where they put down roots and started families and careers. And then, as later, various intellectuals, the jazz musician Butch Watanabe, who had been in the camps and then became a sideman for Oscar Peterson once he got to Montreal, recorded the first bebop record ever recorded in Canada. Roy Kiyooka, the artist and writer, worked at Sir George Williams, which is later Concordia University, during the 1960s. Dr. George Horry, a physician who had been in the camps, founded the Jean Talon Hospital, although later he was thrown out on grounds of conflicts of interest. He then went to Harvard University, so it's not clear whether. The point is just that I will leave it to Roger to explore the history of the community, but this gives us an example not only of parallels to the United States, but of distinctions which point up specificity and global discussion of issues not only of race, but of language, of religion, of economic class, and of the interaction between Japanese Americans and other groups. Thank you. Yes.
You mentioned Montreal was the primary contribution of eastward movement. What about further east than that? Going like to the Maritimes and so forth?
As far as I'm able to learn, there was one Japanese Canadian who moved to Nova Scotia, but basically people did not go farther east than Montreal, except with one exception. There was a hostel that was opened in Farnham in the eastern townships of Quebec for Japanese Canadians, and some 300 people lived there during 1946 and 47. While most people moved afterwards to Montreal, there were still 7 families who remained. It's interesting because I was interviewing one of the families, because every time I've asked people from Farnham, which is a very small town, whether they were aware of the Japanese Canadian presence, they said no. They'd never seen any Japanese Canadians. So finally, when I met one of the families, 7 families, I said, you know, what gives? You guys weren't like Anne Frank staying in the attic all these years. They said, we learned to keep a low profile. Conversely, the woman I mentioned, Betty Kobayashi Kissenman, moved to Halifax in the 1970s, although she remained a community historian of Montreal. And the famous Japanese-American sociologist Setsuko Nishi and her husband, the artist Ken Nishi, went up to Cape Breton Island in the years after World War II and gave seminars, and they were so attracted to Cape Breton Island that they bought land and built their own house along with a collective of other Japanese Americans. And so the Nishi family still lives, part of the time and part of the family, full-time, live in Nova Scotia. But the history of Japanese Canadians in the Maritimes is a very small history.
Jason. I knew Jason was good. He had a smile.
Greg, it's always awesome to hear you speak on this, your vast knowledge of even the one person that moved out to the farthest reaches of Canada. It's awesome. And so I want to use your expertise to answer a question we had in a class on Japanese Americans during World War II, a class that I've inherited from Roger. So one of the things that we looked at is redress in 1988 in the United States, and then the subsequent 2 months later, Canada passes redress. And one of the things they did, in addition to paying $1,000 more to families than
Yes,
the U.S. did.
The Canadians paid $21,000 as opposed to the U.S. paying $20,000. A bit of Canadian one-upmanship, I thought.
Yeah, but then they also created, there was I think $24 million for a center on race relations. And I was wondering if you knew about the life of that institute, or if that came to fruition, what might be learned from that?
Okay. Yes, there were, both in the U.S. and Canada, redress consisted of 2 parts. One part was the individual payment to survivors who had been affected by the executive orders, the order in council in question. And by the way, in Canada, this was a bitter debate, and it delayed the granting of redress for a long time because there was opposition between those who felt that there must be individual redress as a statement of wrongdoing, and those who felt that it would be easier to get if there was just a collective settlement. Gordon Hirabayashi, interestingly enough, who had been one of the Supreme Court defendants in the United States, who was then a professor at University of Alberta, was one of the most strident or most outspoken supporters of individual redress as a way of expressing the wrongdoing, even though he, of course, did not stand to gain anything from getting Canadian redress, because he hadn't been in Canada. So in the United States, of course, it's the Civil Liberties Public Education Project, which gave grants over many years to projects of commemoration. In Canada, the civil liberties fight did give a certain amount to the creation of a Race Relations Institute, which gave some grants, but the largest contribution of the collective aspect of Canadian redress came to creating community centers for Japanese Canadians, and which were used in some cases for old age homes, because of course the average age of people who had been in the camps was about 130. No, the average age was something like 60 or 70. So this was necessary. Of course, I'm myself pleased, but also slightly amused by when I go to Japanese community centers and I find fourth generation or fifth generation children or families educating children in Japanese language and martial arts and taiko drumming. I think it's great that they want to learn their Japanese heritage, but also when they ask me about, what is Japanese American, I say, if you want to learn being Japanese American, study bowling.
Yeah.
Because that's the Japanese American sport.
As somebody who bowls, thank you, Greg. No, I'm going to ask a question and it's a completely big and arguably stupid question, but
There are no stupid questions.
no,
There are
this is a
sometimes
stupid
answers.
question. This is a stupid question, but I think that it will generate a very smart answer from you because of who you are. But I'm curious because there's so much work that has been done around redress, reparation, this particular history, yet time and again, you do have deniers. It's, there is this sense of we've been here before. It seems that, when, just the Association for Asian American Studies had to put out yet another statement that the various travel bans were reminiscent of what happened to Japanese Americans. I'm just curious what you make of this strategic amnesia around incarceration. It's a stupid question, but it's one that haunts me because it doesn't matter what year I teach, students still don't know this history. There was a lot of money put forth in terms of educational support, so I'm just curious what your take is on that.
I think there's still a lot of resistance among white Americans and newer immigrants to understanding that, one of the advantages of redress was actually that it fit into the patriotic narrative. That is, you could say people could say the United States is so great that even when we make a mistake, it's okay, because we make up for it. And I think that in some ways the amnesia is actually to be expected. That is, until recently, with the African American History Museum, there was no museum of slavery in the United States. There is the Museum of, the Native American Museum, but there's no museum of the Trail of Tears. That is, people don't want to look at the negative side of their heritage. And in Canada, this gets even worse. When I looked at the website of Hastings Park, which is where the Japanese Canadians were confined, its history part just said it was taken over by the Canadian Army during World War II. It wasn't until I clicked on the Japanese Garden, which was made by funds donated by the Japanese Canadian community, that you could discover that Hastings Park had been a giant concentration camp during World War II. That's what the Army did with it. I think that it's very difficult for people to accept that history can be so tragic, that particularly for the history of non-whites. And it takes very blatant forms when the United States is at war, because this is itself at war. It's interesting the difference between the level of internment denial in the United States after 9/11 and the level in Canada. That people were much less resistant. There has been no book in
Canada, justifying internment
Yeah.
since the 1980s.
If I can answer that question, because I was struck by that, having taught the course, which Jason inherited. This lapse of memory, and there are I was struck by this, and I would ask my students what did they know about the history of incarceration, and I don't know what's going on in textbooks, in history textbooks. I know when I was coming on many years ago, I don't know that there was anything that I can recall, and I say most of my books that dealt with Japanese American incarceration. I think what has to be done, though, the answer then, we have a woman here, a friend, and that represents a step. And Ms. Patty Carroll, sitting right here, has brought her middle school 8th graders. It's a small step, but she has brought her 8th grade students to this class. I don't know how many years she has done that. And then what some of my students have done to add evidence to their memory is in curricular changes. I mean, how many students have had done that? I mean, they all don't come back and tell me, but 2 or 3 have come back and said, Professor Buckley, I'm teaching at this Glastonbury, he's up there, but Glastonbury High School, and they are able now, or in Glastonbury a couple of years ago, they have added sections to the added components to the American history section. I don't know how long they teach that, but they have added a component dealing with incarceration. So I think that there are steps like that one has to take in order to build this memory of this event. But I've always been struck by that despite the fact that of its enormity, very few Americans, and probably in Canada as well, know very little about that. So curricular changes, I think that's one. Courses like this, I don't know how many courses on the Eastern Seaboard or maybe perhaps curriculums. How many courses are there that deal with Japanese American incarceration? I don't know that there are many, but I think there's small steps like that. And you mentioned a museum. Maybe that's what we're aiming for at some point down the line. A Japanese American museum. Now,
And there is the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles.
We have that, yes.
And there is an exhibit at the Museum of American History at the Smithsonian Institution, and those help. And again, the government has given money for the confinement sites grants to preserve the confinement sites, but we still face an ocean of willful ignorance.
You're in trouble, yes. Okay.
Several months ago, I contacted Roger. My daughter went to the University of California, and so her alumni magazine comes to the house. So I'm looking through the magazine, and there's an article about USC's announcement that they're offering a course on Japanese American interns. What is this? And it was so shocking because the way they phrased it was that they're one of the leaders in this, and the thing though, I guess the thing about it was that they had the professor talking about the students that were in class. And the students in the class, they're not all Californians, they're from all over the place, but they were like, wow, did that really happen? So it's not just East Coast people that are not open.
When I published By Order of the President, I got a book tour. Yes, it tells you how long ago this was. My publisher arranged a book tour for me, and I went around Los Angeles, speaking at various radio stations and other things. And I was talking with my driver, who was a woman slightly older than me, but the point being that she had not heard about Japanese Americans and knew nothing about internment. And So, we talked about it at various times during the day. And then just as she was about to, at long last, drop me off for the night, we happened to be speaking about, where we came from. And she said, oh, I come from a little town in Washington State, which you've never heard of probably, called Puyallup. And I quickly explained about Camp Harmony and the assembly center that had been there. And the woman was aghast. She wanted to call up her mother and strangle her for not having told her. I mean, she was born just a couple of years after the war, but already somebody from those places. And I think that because the U.S. won the war, it was kind of embarrassing to be swept under the table. And then even when it has been commemorated, the problem is that it's an exceptional incident.
Yeah.
It's an unfortunate wartime question. It's not revealed as part of a larger history of racism in the United States and connected with other things. I was talking with Jason earlier because he's talking with his class about redress. And the point is that the redress movement starts as part of a larger interracial movement against white supremacy. And it's sort of a pie in the sky thing. It's really just sort of activists using demands for reparations as a way of outlining the historical oppression. And in fact, the first important defenders of Japanese American reparations were blacks, the black political class in California. Augustus Hawkins, who had voted against removal, and Yvonne Braithwaite Burke, and Tom Bradley, the mayor of Los Angeles, and most importantly, Mervyn Dimely, who was the representative for Gardena, who introduced one of the first redress bills. But as redress became more of a possibility, and it kept narrowing, and the JCL and the lobbyists on behalf of Japanese Americans who were pushing it made it more and more an exceptional thing, a patriotic element. It became HR 442 in honor, or 1776, in honor of the Japanese American soldiers. And they deliberately restricted it to living persons in order to short circuit any claim for reparations for slavery by African Americans. And coming in that context, and also coming in the context of black bashing by officials in Japan, there were a number of African Americans who opposed redress, either on the grounds that we deserve it more, or that it's a scam because it's Japanese are trying to show that they're better than blacks, and yet it serves as the main precedent for black demands for reparations. So these things are extraordinarily complex. Again, as Ms. Gomez said, in a white supremacist culture, it's very tempting to look down on other minorities and to fight and to not realize that your issues form part of a larger movement, form part of a larger historical trend.
So we've got a couple of questions here. Margot and then Catherine.
I'd just like to comment on the question because, in my area, as you know, I work in contemporary art and I do a lot of oral history work with Japanese American artists. And one thing I have to notice is how for those people who are aware of it, how persistent the internment is for them as an issue. And on one level, we can talk about collective trauma and, the idea they said the urgency of memory was still some of these artists are engaged with it, most of whom are the descendants of people who were returned. In other words, there's generally family connection that keeps it going. So I observed that issue, like a lot of people say, oh yes, the internment, we know, but these people I talk to, they go, oh yeah, we know about this. And actually, the answer to that is actually no. That there's a kind of still a kind of lacunae and a erasure that people continually struggle with. But I guess my question is, last week when I was presenting a Japanese Mexican artist, this woman, she's a Saldamondo, who had done a performance in a collaborative piece in Hawaii, but the subject was Honolulu, and tried to make a connection between for the internment of Japanese on the mainland, the fact that most people don't know that there was even like an imprisonment facility in Oahu as well, which I know is a subject that I'm getting to the question.
I can wait.
Oh, sorry. And then, of course, she was also linking that on to current day, like other groups are also experiencing that kind of persecution. So I guess the question is, since you said you just published something on the internment in Hawaii. I mean, I guess what I want to ask is, what do you see as the major takeaway from that, other than the fact that it happened and most people don't know about it? What does that add to our understanding?
Well, what I spoke about is Japanese Americans under martial law. Yes, there's Honolulu, which is worthy of attention, and because it was so long buried, and the specificity of that. But it's on a macro level, the experience of Japanese Americans under martial law. The Army commanders who became military governors in Hawaii resisted President Roosevelt's and the Navy Secretary's pressure for mass removal and confinement of people of Japanese ancestry. Hawaii thus becomes the only place in the Pacific Rim where there are Japanese people of Japanese ancestry where they're not interned en masse. It's not, and in essence, this is seen as a triumph of American democracy, as well as a counterexample to the fears of the mainland. At the same time, and there is a certain something to be said for that. At the same time, the Army commanders in Hawaii used the fact that all these Japanese Americans, up to 40% of the population, were at large, as an excuse to hold on to power long after the military situation made it clear that there was no possibility of a Japanese attack, that there was no possibility of an overturning of the government. And they used racist reasoning. We can't have Japanese American, we can't have civilian assemblies because then you'll have Japanese American elected officials and they can't be trusted. We can't have civilian courts because then you'll have Japanese American jurors and they can't be trusted. And they got away with it. They were able to keep hold of emergency powers until the end of 1944, until 2 weeks before the 1944 election. So it shows that really people with a plausible excuse of military necessity can reverse fundamental rights long after they can make a case for any actual emergency. But actually another of the things that I've been working on and is quite ignored is another episode of Japanese American internment, the internment in the U.S. territory known as the Canal Zone in Panama. Within hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Panama's government collaborated with the United States government to round up all of the 300 people of Japanese ancestry living in Panama to put them illegally into the Canal Zone and thus be interned under U.S. authority in Camp Taruga. And eventually they were all sent to the U.S. mainland as foreign internees. So this is, again, an example of how the gray areas of sovereignty between Panama, the Republic of Panama, and the U.S. Canal Zone, like today Guantanamo, are used by the U.S. government to violate basic rights.
So we'll close with Catherine, your question.
When I came to UConn in 1984, there was a professor, Minnie Nagoro, renowned ceramicist who had retired shortly after I came, and I met her work must be at the Benton Museum, but ceramics, the facility was, I think, over in the Yellow Barn. It's such an amazing communal art form that I just remember how powerful the students talked about the stories that she told when she worked with them. And I'm sure her work has probably been celebrated here since she was such an important faculty member. I think she probably retired in the late 90s and is no longer living. She lived in Mason's Island. But I remember, my own experience of that, which I probably never learned in school, was from this, amazing professor who was, again, a renowned artist who was here and who also kind of taught by example of her work, not only to faculty like myself, who are largely ignorant of these things, but also the students. She was a really powerful presence, and I'm sure her work is probably at the Benton Museum, and you probably knew of her. Anyone's been here at UConn as long as I have been.
As Margot has made clear by her work and work of others. Art has proved a very powerful weapon in the destructing of the myth, deconstructing of the legends of Japanese American internment, and in offering a voice to those, particularly those who were in the camps, to express their experience, whether it's Roger Shimomura, whether it's Mine Okubo, whether it's the dozens of other artists who actually worked in the camps and then were trained. Shiro Obata, the renowned artist, ran a school. And so both directly and indirectly, people were able to use art to speak about their experience at a time when there was no literature by Japanese Americans about their experience. And so it's something that's quite struck me, and one of the reasons why I've become a kind of debutante art historian, because I've been interested in ways that people, that the subaltern speaks, that people express and make sense of their experience.
So with that, let's give a huge round of applause. And another, like just a huge round of applause for Roger Buckley.